Right. So the second law of thermodynamics basically states that the universe naturally moves toward maximum entropy.
And entropy is like a measure of chaos or disorder, right?
Exactly. Chaos, disorder, randomness, equilibrium. Think about building a complex sandcastle on a beach.
Okay.
If you leave it entirely alone, the wind and the waves will eventually just flatten it out into regular, indistinguishable sand.
Right.
That flattening is entropy in action. And according to Kunis, complex human societies, civilizations with functioning power grids, legal systems, safe streets, they are physical anomalies.
So they're like the sandcastle.
Precisely. They are tiny islands of low entropy, they are highly ordered, and they require a monumental amount of energy to sustain themselves against the ambient chaos of the broader environment.
And to explain how these low-entropy islands survive, he introduces a biological parallel, which is the cell membrane.
Yeah.
And this is actually where the title of the essay comes from.
Right. The stronger membrane wins. So a biological cell only survives because its membrane is selectively permeable.
Meaning it blocks things out.
It actively blocks passive diffusion. If a cell just let everything flow in and out equally, its internal environment would equalize with the outside environment, and it would immediately die.
So what does it do instead?
Instead, the cell engages in what biologists call active transport. It uses energy, specifically ATP, to move necessary molecules against the concentration gradient.
So it's actively bringing in nutrients and pushing out waste.
Exactly. It takes work.
Okay, so connecting this to a nation, Kunis is saying that a country acts exactly like a cell membrane because there is a massive global concentration gradient of, wealth, security, and opportunity.
Right. And the natural, unguided flow of human migration is always going to follow that gradient. It flows from high-entropy, disordered places directly into low-entropy, highly ordered places.
So the nation functions as a giant pump.
It has to.
Yeah.
To maintain its internal order, it has to expend energy to filter entrance. It has to deliberately select for individuals who will contribute to the system's internal order.
Because integrating newcomers is a, what does he call it? A metabolic cost.
Yes, a metabolic cost. Teaching them the language, assimilating them to local norms, providing infrastructure, it all burns energy.
Wow.
If the sheer volume of people coming in exceeds the nation's metabolic capacity to process them, the internal environment destabilizes.
Okay, I want to push back on this slightly, or at least clarify the depth of this metaphor. Is Kunis actually arguing that human migration is literally just a blind physical force, like heat equalizing in a room? Because that strips away all human agency, right?
Well, he treats it precisely as a thermodynamic mechanism. And to explain how the door to the nation works, he actually pulls a concept from theoretical physics called Maxwell's demon.
Maxwell's demon. Okay, break that down for us.
So Maxwell's demon is a theoretical entity. Imagine a little demon sitting at a trapdoor between two gas chambers.
Okay.
By observing the speed of individual molecules, the demon only opens the door to let the fast ones through. And by doing that, it creates a temperature difference between the chambers.
So it creates order out of equilibrium.
Exactly. But in physics, this demon cannot do this for free. It has to expend energy to acquire the information needed to do the sorting.
Ah.
Kunis equates this demon directly to a nation's immigration apparatus. A functioning border authority has to expend energy to process information.
Like checking criminal history, verifying skills, assessing cultural compatibility.
Right. They do all that to sort entrance and maintain the internal temperature of the country.
So what happens when the demon gets overwhelmed? Like, say, during a mass migration event, or if political ideology dictates that sorting is no longer necessary.
Well, the demon stops sorting, and the door is just left open.
And the desert heat rushes in.
Exactly. The inevitable result is a rapid equilibration. Kunis argues that a wealthy, high-trust nation that opens its borders to a poor, low-trust world will just descend to the average entropy level of the global system.
Wow.
He actually quotes systems theorist Gregory Bateson here saying, the boundary is the system.
The boundary is the system.
Yeah. If you cannot filter what crosses your perimeter, you no longer have a distinct system.
Okay, so if a nation is this low-entropy, heavily air-conditioned room that requires constant active energy to keep cool, the logical next question is, who actually owns the room?
Right.
And who is paying the electric bill to run the pump? Because that takes us from the realm of physics right into property rights.
Exactly. Kunis argues the standard framing of borders, where debates center entirely on, compassion versus cruelty is completely the wrong paradigm.
So what's his frame?
The correct frame is property. He starts with John Locke's labor theory of property.
Right, classic philosophy.
Yeah, Locke proposed that when you mix your labor with the natural world, you create a legitimate claim of ownership. You clear a forest, you plow a field, it becomes your field.
But Kunis scales that concept up past the individual,
Right.
applying it to the entire civilization.
He does. He says the nation itself, its safe streets, its impartial courts, the accumulated social trust, the infrastructure, these are artificial constructs built by the accumulated labor and the foregone consumption of previous generations.
Foregone consumption, meaning your ancestors chose to build institutions rather than just, consuming all their resources immediately.
Precisely. Therefore, the current citizens are the rightful heirs to this collective property. And the state's only legitimate role is acting as the trustee of that property.
This makes me think of citizenship like holding shares in a collective enterprise.
That's a great way to look at it.
So under this framework, does Kunis view open borders as essentially a massive, unauthorized stock dilution for the native citizens?
That analogy maps perfectly onto his argument, and he leans heavily on Elinor Ostrom to justify this.
Ostrom, she won the Nobel Prize, right?
She did, yeah, the Nobel Prize in Economics for her work on the tragedy of the commons. She studied how communities manage shared resources sustainably, things like fisheries, forests, irrigation systems.
Okay, what did she find?
Her very first foundational rule for preventing a shared resource from being destroyed is that there must be clearly defined boundaries.
Okay.
You must have the absolute power of exclusion. If you don't, free riders will capture the benefits without ever sharing the costs of maintenance.
That makes sense.
And her second rule is that there must be a proportional equivalence between benefits and costs.
So if we apply Ostrom's rules to a modern welfare state, Kunis would argue that open borders inherently violate that proportional equivalence.
Entirely. Migrants who enter a developed nation immediately access public goods like healthcare systems, public transit, general security, and those things were capitalized by generations of previous taxpayers.
Right.
Kunis describes this fundamental asymmetry as creating a sucker's payoff for the native population. I mean, why pay into a system if the dividends are just distributed to anyone who walks across the line?
Right. Why contribute to the commons if there's no boundary?
Exactly. And to back this up, he brings in political theorist Hans Hermann Hoppe's concept of forced integration.
Forced integration, meaning the state forces you, the shareholder, to share the property against your will.
Yeah. Hoppe argues that public property isn't magically unowned. It is explicitly held in trust for the taxpayers who funded it.
Okay.
When the state allows in immigrants that the specific property owners did not invite, it forces citizens to subsidize individuals they didn't choose to associate with. It actively erodes the nation's capital stock.
Wow.
For Kunis, the nation-state is just the scaled-up solution to the tragedy of the commons, and the border is the literal fence that makes the commons mathematically possible.
Okay, so we've established that in this model, nations are carefully guarded property fighting against entropy. But how did these distinct groups of shareholders form in the first place? Like, how do you get a group of people to agree to build the air-conditioned room together?
How do you build the trust?
Exactly. This leads us into evolutionary pressures and the formation of culture. Kunis calls this precipitation.
Yeah, he argues nations precipitate out of environmental pressure, very much like crystals forming from a solution. He bases this mechanism on the cold winters hypothesis and life history theory, specifically looking at RK selection.
Slow down and really map out the mechanics of that cold winters hypothesis.
Right. So as early humans migrated into northern latitudes, survival in temperate and Arctic zones required solving intensely complex, long-term problems.
Like what?
Well, you had to build insulated shelter, you had to source fuel to stay warm, and critically, you had to store food for the winter. The environment acted as a lethal filter.
Because if you mess up, you die.
Exactly. This required what economists call a low time preference, which is basically the cognitive capacity to delay gratification. You had to have the impulse control to forego eating all your food today, or you would literally starve to death in January.
Oh, wow. So Kunis argues this harsh environment ruthlessly selected for specific traits associated with high future orientation and high social cohesion, which is the K strategy.
Right. High investment, long-term planning. And compared to a tropical environment where caloric resources are generally available year-round, that extreme future orientation wasn't a matter of immediate life and death.
Right.
So higher time preference strategies and art strategy could persist without the environment wiping them out.
That's the argument. And from this environmental baseline, Kunis builds out what he calls the precipitation chain. It's a causal sequence.
Okay, walk us through it.
First, the environment creates a brutal selection pressure, heavily shaping traits like time preference and in-group trust.
And because the environment filters for those specific traits, you get people with similar cognitive profiles clustering together.
Exactly, they cluster, which drastically lowers their coordination costs. Think about it. If everyone in your group shares a deeply ingrained, high-trust norm against stealing, you don't need to expend energy constantly guarding your crops from your neighbors.
Right, you can sleep at night.
And you can take that saved energy and use it to build a communal mill instead. That cheap coordination creates a massive surplus of value. So the surplus leads to the border. Because once you have a functioning mill and stored grain, you suddenly have something worth defending from outsiders who didn't contribute to building it. So you establish a boundary.
And once the boundary is established, you need a mythos.
A mythos, like a story.
Yeah, a founding story, a shared religion, or a national epic to legally and morally justify that boundary to yourselves and others. Over centuries, that mythos and the formal institutions co-evolve with the population into what we recognize as a distinct culture.
Which brings us to one of his most fascinating analogies in the entire piece, which is the distinction between hardware and software.
Right. This is central to his whole framework. For Kunis, the hardware is the population itself, their genetic substrate, their specific trait distributions, and the cognitive profiles shaped by thousands of years of those environmental pressures.
Okay, and the software?
The software is the culture, the legal codes, the banking systems, the constitution, the behavioral norms. His core argument here is that the software encodes solutions that only work for that specific population's capabilities.
Meaning the software implicitly assumes the hardware it evolved on.
Precise.
It's like trying to run the latest Mac operating system on a 1990s toaster.
Yes, exactly.
You can't just transplant the software code and expect the machine to run if the underlying motherboard is completely incompatible.
And to prove that you cannot just hot swap software, he uses two massive historical case studies. First, a story of successful adaptation, which is Meiji Japan in 1868.
Okay.
Facing the threat of Western imperialism, Japan deliberately imported Western institutional software.
So they brought in what exactly?
Telegraph networks, modern banking, Prussian-style legal codes, industrial technology, but they rigidly excluded Western immigration. Their motto was Wakon Yosai, which translates to Japanese spirit, Western techniques.
Ah, love that.
Because their hardware was highly homogeneous, possessing immense social cohesion and a shared rigorous work ethic, they could install the new institutions with almost zero friction. They modernized from an agrarian feudal society to an industrial superpower incredibly fast.
Wow. And the counterexample is Liberia, which shows what happens when the hardware and software don't match.
Yes, Liberia is what Kunis bluntly calls cargo cult constitutionalism.
Cargo cult constitutionalism, that is quite a phrase.
It is. Founded in 1822 by the American Colonization Society for Freed American Slaves, Liberia completely copy-pasted the United States institutional software.
Really? Like word for word?
Pretty much. They had a constitution modeled directly on the U.S. They had a president, a Senate, House of Representatives. But the underlying population's deep cultural norms and trust radius were entirely disconnected from the assumptions built into those institutions.
So what happened?
The Americo-Liberian settlers effectively formed a ruling caste that oppressed the indigenous African majority. The software was fundamentally incompatible with the on-the-ground reality. It led to complete state failure and a series of horrific civil wars.
Oh, wow.
As Kunis puts it, constitutions are not magical incantations. You can't just read them aloud and spawn a functioning democracy.
Okay, so if hardware and software are intimately linked and you can't just transplant them, what happens when a nation actively tries to mix entirely different operating systems together within the same physical boundary?
Well, this brings us to what Kunis calls the friction of diversity and the resulting diversity tax. He relies heavily here on a massive landmark sociological study by Robert Putnam called E Pluribus Unum.
Yeah.
Putnam studied 30,000 Americans across 41 different communities.
Now, I imagine Putnam went into this massive study expecting contact theory to hold true, right? Because that's the classic American melting pot assumption, that living side by side with different groups naturally breaks down prejudice over time as people just get to know each other.
That was exactly Putnam's hope. He is a self-described progressive, But the data showed the exact opposite, and he actually delayed publishing the results for years because he was so disturbed by them.
Wait, he held the data back?
Yeah, for years. Because Putnam found that in ethnically diverse neighborhoods, people of all races effectively hunker down.
Hunkered out, like they withdraw.
Yes. Confidence in local government drops, volunteering drops, charitable giving drops. Trust in neighbors is literally cut in half in high diversity zones compared to homogeneous ones.
That's staggering.
And the most devastating finding was that diversity didn't just reduce trust between different ethnic groups, it reduced trust within a person's own group. In highly diverse settings, people just distrust everyone across the board.
But didn't Putnam hope this hunkering down was just a temporary growing pain, like a transitional phase before a new, broader identity forms? Does Kunis really argue this diversity tax is a permanent structural law of physics for multi-ethnic societies?
Kunis argues it is an inescapable structural feature based on what's called constrict theory. Think of shared cultural norms as a low-entropy carrier wave for social transactions.
Okay.
Homogeneity acts as a social lubricant. You don't need to constantly explain yourself. Diversity introduces noise into that communication channel. It acts like sand in the gears of society.
Because of all the friction.
Exactly. Every interaction carries a higher cognitive load because you do not share the same baseline assumptions. Therefore, to maintain order in a diverse society, the system has to pump in massive amounts of external energy.
Like the Maxwell's demon having to work overtime.
Yes. You need more police to mediate disputes, more lawyers, more complex legal adjudication, massive HR departments, and diversity management bureaucracies.
And all that extra energy requirement, the literal cost of mediating constant friction, that is the diversity tax.
Precisely.
Okay, but is it completely impossible to manage that diversity then? What about a place like Singapore? They seem to do it.
Well, Kunis points to Singapore as one of the only places that manages it successfully, but he defines it as the Singapore tradeoff.
The trade-off.
Singapore works, but only through extreme, uncompromising authoritarian control.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they utilize the ethnic integration policy, which enforces strict mathematical racial quotas in every single public housing block, so ethnic enclaves literally cannot form.
Wow, they engineer it.
Heavily. And they utilize the Internal Security Act, allowing the government to preemptively detain individuals without trial for any speech that threatens racial harmony. Speech is heavily policed.
So the trade-off is stability in exchange for liberty.
Yes. Kunis summarizes it bluntly. High diversity plus high stability equals low freedom. Managing high entropy requires high coercive energy. If a society wants to be free and open, it must be naturally homogeneous. If it wants to be diverse and stable, it must be authoritarian.
Wow. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. If diverse societies require constant authoritarian energy to hold together, what happens when that energy runs out?
Yeah.
Or, perhaps more dangerously, what happens when a very strong cultural membrane collides with a weak one? Kunis introduces a concept he calls the infinity hack.
Right. Earlier we discussed how populations need a mythos to maintain their membrane. Kunis theorizes that the strongest possible membrane is created by transcendent religious backing. Because human beings naturally discount future rewards, it is incredibly difficult to convince people to sacrifice their own comfort today for the good of the system tomorrow.
Behavioral Economics 101.
Exactly. But if you introduce infinite stakes, the promise of eternal heaven or the threat of eternal hell, it completely overrides human discounting. It's an infinity hack.
Because it makes the cost of membrane maintenance sacrificing for the group always worth paying, since the reward is literally infinite.
Right. And to illustrate this clash, Kunis compares two membranes actively meeting in contemporary Europe. On one side, you have Islam, which he describes as an incredibly strong totalistic membrane.
Okay.
It utilizes transcendent backing, it has extraordinarily high exit costs like severe apostasy norms, and it demands high-frequency daily rituals that constantly reinforce the boundary.
Like praying 5 times a day.
Exactly. On the other side, you have post-Enlightenment, secular Christianity in Europe, which functions as a weak partial membrane.
Weak in what way?
Well, it is highly secularized. It normalizes and even celebrates leaving the faith or questioning the group, and its rituals are largely private and low demand.
And to be clear for our listeners, Kunis isn't making a theological judgment about which religion is true or morally superior here. He is strictly looking at these belief systems as thermodynamic structures.
Absolutely.
So what happens when these two structures collide?
When a strong, high-energy membrane meets a weak, low-energy one, the strong one maintains its integrity. Kunis points to the sociological phenomenon of segmented assimilation.
Segmented assimilation.
Yeah, instead of a melting pot where the new arrivals adopt the host culture, second-generation immigrants might assimilate downward into oppositional subcultures, creating permanent parallel societies.
They just build their own membrane inside the other one.
Right. And to prove this isn't just a temporary geographic issue, he cites deep economic research by Giuliano and Nunn.
What do they find?
They tracked the descendants of specific immigrant groups over multiple generations. They found that a third-generation immigrant still heavily exhibits the baseline trust levels and savings rates of their grandparents' origin country.
Oh, wow. 3 generations later.
Yes. You cannot simply overwrite a population's cultural software just by moving them to a new geographic location. The traits persist.
And if you try to force these different persistent membranes together into an artificial state boundary, Kunis argues you inevitably get what he calls entropic collapse.
Yes. Just look at the historical examples of Yugoslavia or the USSR. They were high entropy, artificial constructions masking deep divisions. Yugoslavia was held together purely by the immense external coercion of Tito's communist dictatorship.
So that authoritarian coercion was the constant energy input required to hold apart the natural low-entropy groupings of Serbs, Croats, and Bosniaks.
Exactly.
It was essentially stored potential energy. The state was a pressure cooker, and the dictator was just holding the lid down.
And once Tito died and that coercive energy dropped below a critical threshold, the system underwent a violent phase transition.
The lid blew off.
The stored entropy was released as kinetic violence, and the state shattered along natural, historical, ethno-national lines. Kunis argues that a multi-ethnic state is thermodynamically unstable without continuous, heavy-handed coercion.
So synthesizing all of this, what does it mean for us today? Kunis explicitly claims the West is currently running an experiment in membrane dissolution.
Yes.
The host membrane was deliberately weakened by intellectual deconstruction, while entirely foreign membranes were imported at scale. If our Maxwell's demon at the border is paralyzed by political gridlock, and our secular membrane is too weak to assimilate newcomers, what exactly does Kunis predict is the endgame for Western nations?
Well, if his analysis is correct, he asserts the trajectory is governed by physics, not politics. And he predicts 4 main outcomes.
Okay, what's the first?
First, secular and liberal states will eventually lose out to transcendently backed ones, because secular states lack the infinity hack necessary to convince citizens to sacrifice for group cohesion.
Okay, and the second?
Second, multi-ethnic states will inevitably fragment along hardware lines the moment state coercion or extreme economic abundance lifts.
Ooh.
Third, homogeneous high-trust societies will financially and socially outperform diverse low-trust ones because they don't bleed off resources paying the massive diversity tax.
Right. And the fourth?
And fourth, universal values projects will fail. Because universal values are just a trade protocol like TCP/IP on the internet, allowing different computers to talk. They are a protocol, not a replacement for a deeply rooted cultural operating system.
Those are incredibly harsh, deterministic predictions. Does he offer any exceptions where a society could hold together in the future despite these physical laws?
He lists 3 very rare exceptions. One is environmental forcing.
Like the cold winters again.
Exactly. Imagine a colony on Mars. The environment is so lethal that it instantly kills anyone who doesn't perfectly coordinate. The harsh physics of the environment forces absolute cohesion.
What's the second exception?
Design selection, where a state exerts absolute granular control over entry to ensure total hardware compatibility before anyone is allowed to install the local software.
Kind of like the Maxwell's demon running on supercomputers.
Exactly. And the third is a massive transcendent revival, where a fracturing society somehow regenerates its cultural membrane through a massive unifying religious awakening.
Wow. Okay, Kunis focuses almost entirely on physical borders and physical hardware. But if traditional physical nations are undergoing this entropic collapse, could the next impenetrable membranes be entirely digital?
That's interesting.
Because if culture really is just software running on human hardware, maybe the future isn't defined by physical walls and borders on a map. Maybe the low-entropy islands of the future are decentralized, cloud-based communities completely locked behind cryptographic membranes where only verified contributors can enter. Just something to chew on.
That is a fascinating implication when you remove geography from the equation.
It really is. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it gave you a new lens to view the world, even if it completely challenges your baseline assumptions. Keep questioning, keep exploring. I'll catch you next time.